Chronic rejection is a type of transplant rejection that happens months to years after receiving a new graft. Chronic rejection is mediated by both cellular and humoral immunity. In this video, I'll share my visual mnemonic to help you remember all the information about chronic rejection so you'll be ready for test day. First, let's set the scene. We are inside a war tent during the medieval period, where one general has rejected the treaty of another general. Generals are grisly, experienced old fighters who have been around for ages. These old people kind of remind me of a chronic disease course, since chronic in medical terms refers to something that happens slowly, taking time to develop. And the rejected treaty? Well, that represents transplant rejection. Putting this together, this rejection between two old people is our anchor for chronic transplant rejection. Fittingly, chronic rejection is the slowest type of transplant rejection, with organ failure taking place months to years after a transplant. To drive this point home, remember that wars also take a long time because people can't agree on peace treaties and such. You can bet these grizzled generals have been fighting for years for things to get this heated. Again, chronic rejection takes place in the months to years after a transplant. Now that we know it happens slowly, let's talk about what actually causes chronic transplant rejection. Actually, there's two major actors here. We'll cover these in our next two symbols. First, take a look at the weapon one general is holding, a tomahawk. Tomahawks are not only great war weapons, but they also serve as a recurring symbol for T cells. You know, since tomahawks start with the letter T and are used for close-range combat, similar to how T cells work by direct contact. We're talking about T cells here, since T cell reactivity to the foreign graft over time is a core contributor to chronic transplant rejection. While we can stop some T cell activation to the graft with immunosuppressant drugs, we cannot suppress it entirely. As a result, T cell-mediated damage over time contributes to chronic rejection. Since our T cells are reacting inappropriately, chronic transplant rejection is technically an example of type 4 hypersensitivity, describing cell-mediated overreaction. But T cells aren't the only actor in chronic rejection. Take a look at the other general's weapon, a bow with arrows. Especially noticed how the arrows are Y-shaped, kind of like an antibody. Yep, these Y-shaped arrows should remind you of antibodies, which are shot out of our bow, our recurring symbol for B cells. You see, humoral antibodies also play a major role in chronic transplant rejection. During chronic rejection, T cells activate B cells to produce tons of antibodies that are specifically targeted against donor antigens. These antibodies then go and coat the donor cells, targeting them for attack. Graft toxicity is then mediated by things like NK cells or complement, which recognize bound antibody and attack the donor cells. This inappropriate antibody-mediated immune activity is therefore an example of type 2 hypersensitivity. So chronic rejection is a mix of type 2 and type 4 hypersensitivity, mediated by both T and B cells. Let's keep moving to find out what happens when our immune system attacks. Next, take a look at all the battle scars on this general. All generals have scars from wars, right? The scars coincidentally remind me that the overgrowth of scar tissues, formerly called fibrosis, is another sign of chronic transplant rejection. To understand why this happens, recall that tissue injury causes the subsequent development of scar tissue. Thus, the repeated attacks by T cells and antibodies followed by healing slowly lead to an overgrowth of scar tissue in the graft, also known as interstitial fibrosis. Additionally, since this process also damages blood vessels in the graft, hardened scar tissues can develop in the blood vessels, classically the arteries. Therefore, another classic sign of chronic transplant rejection is arteriosclerosis. Since both of these findings are just forms of tissue scarring, you can use this general's battle scars to remember a buildup of scar tissue in the graft. Next, notice the muscles on this general. I always think of these built athletic types in a general. By the way, these big muscles on our general remind me of smooth muscle proliferation, another hallmark of chronic transplant rejection. You see, in chronic rejection, our immune cells are constantly migrating to the blood vessels surrounding the new organ to attack the region. A side effect of the presence of immune cell activation here is that they trigger smooth muscle growth in the blood vessels. leading to the development of thick bands of smooth muscles. This is formally called smooth muscle proliferation, a biopsy finding you need to know on test day. Finally, it looks like one general is particularly angry and decided to break this candle holder to prove a point. Since this candle holder looks cylindrical, kind of like the tube and the structure of blood vessels or airways, the utter obliteration of this vessel-like candle holder should remind you of luminal obliteration, or the total blockage of a tube. So we know both scar tissue and smooth muscle growth can happen during chronic rejection. All this tissue growth takes space, so you can imagine how this could lead to a narrowing of a tube's opening, also known as luminal obliteration. You may also find luminal obliteration to be referred to by other names, depending on which type of organ it affects. For example, in lung transplants, blockage of the small airways or bronchioles is called bronchiolitis obliterans, literally referring to the obliteration of bronchioles. In heart transplants, luminal obliteration happens in the blood vessels, manifesting as accelerated or rapid arteriosclerosis. In the kidney, obliteration of primary blood vessels produces graft nephropathy. And finally, chronic rejection of liver transplants results in bile duct obliteration. All of these things, bronchioles, blood vessels, and bile ducts, are just examples of small tube-like structures. Just remember this obliterated candle holder to remember luminal obliteration. All right, and that's it for chronic rejection. Let's leave the generals to make peace and get out of here. Chronic rejection is a type of transplant rejection that happens months to years after receiving a new transplant. In chronic rejection, damage is mediated by both T cells and antibodies directed against the graft. Repeated injury over time leads to smooth muscle proliferation and development of scar tissue as interstitial fibrosis or arteriosclerosis. Ultimately, this results in luminal obliteration, a classic sign of chronic transplant rejection. And now we're actually done with chronic rejection. I'll see you in the next one.